The air crackled with static as the comm relays fizzled, leaving only the ghostly silence of deep space. Commander Eris Veyron leaned over the holotable aboard the Resolute, his eyes locked onto the feed from a recon drone as it transmitted its last moments. On screen, flames engulfed the once thriving colony of Arkan Prime, the blaze licking the sky like tongues of hellfire. Buildings collapsed into heaps of molten slag. Screams, faint but unmistakable, cut through the feed before it blinked into static. The only sound left in the command center was the shallow, controlled breathing of the men around him. Eris straightened, the overhead lights casting sharp shadows across his face. His voice was steady, but his clenched fists betrayed the storm within. "That's the third colony this week," he said, his words precise and sharp, like a scalpel cutting through bone. 3 million souls wiped out because they dared to want freedom. "Commander, we've confirmed the Empire's flagship in orbit," Lieutenant Jorik Delon reported from his station, his tone tight with suppressed anger. The younger officer's knuckles were white as he gripped the console. "No survivors, no warning. They're sending a message." Eris turned, his gaze piercing. "And they think we're too broken to reply." The room fell silent, heavy with unspoken truths. The Empire had been tightening its grip on humanity for decades, treating Earth and its colonies as an afterthought, a relic of a war-torn past unworthy of their respect. Now the message was clear. Resistance would be met with annihilation. Eris's mind raced, the weight of leadership pressing down on him like the gravity of his homeworld. He couldn't afford to falter. Not here, not now. Earth's fleet was scattered, its resources meager compared to the Empire's vast armada. Yet in this moment, he saw something the Empire couldn't. The ember of defiance still burning in humanity's heart. "Get me the Council," Eris ordered, his voice cutting through the tension. "It's time we stop waiting for a miracle and start becoming one." The Council chamber aboard the Resolute was a stark contrast to the devastation on Arkan Prime. Its polished steel walls reflected the dim glow of holographic projections, maps of colony systems, fleet positions, casualty reports. The air was cold, sterile, a reminder of how far humanity had fallen from its once proud dominion over its own destiny. 12 men sat around the circular table, their faces lined with exhaustion and anger. Some were military commanders, others scientists, strategists, and former leaders of the now crumbled colonies. Each bore the weight of humanity's survival, but none more than Eris, who stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding. "They're exterminating us," Eris began, his voice low but unwavering. "Not just our people, but the very idea of humanity as a free species. Arkan Prime wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. And if we keep reacting instead of acting, we'll be next." "And what do you propose?" Admiral Caden Thalos asked, his tone clipped. The older man was a veteran of humanity's last failed rebellion, his left arm replaced by a cybernetic prosthetic after an Imperial strike. "We can't fight them ship for ship. Our fleets are barely holding the trade lanes." Eris met his gaze, steel against steel. "We don't fight them where they're strong. We fight them where they're blind." A murmur rippled through the room, a mix of intrigue and skepticism. Eris stepped closer to the holotable, activating a projection of Earth's surface. The image zoomed in on a region marked with ancient coordinates, revealing a vast expanse of mountains and buried structures. "This," Eris said, his voice rising with conviction, "is what they've forgotten. Earth isn't just our home. It's our greatest weapon. Before the Empire, we were architects of destruction and creation. There are weapons buried beneath our soil, weapons the Empire has never faced." One of the scientists, a wiry man named Dr. Vinar Kall, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "The black ships," he whispered, almost reverently. "I thought they were a myth." "They're real," Eris said, locking eyes with the room. "And if we find them, we can show the Empire what it means to awaken a sleeping giant." Later that day, Eris stood on the observation deck, staring out at the vast emptiness of space. The distant stars twinkled, oblivious to the suffering playing out in their light. He heard the hiss of the door behind him as Jorik entered, his footsteps hesitant. "You're going through with this," Jorek said, less a question and more a resigned statement. Eris turned, his expression unreadable. "I don't have a choice." Jorek crossed his arms, his frustration barely contained. "Digging up ancient weapons buried on Earth? You know what that sounds like, right? Desperation." "It is desperation," Eris shot back, his voice tinged with a rare edge of vulnerability. "But it's also our only chance. The Empire doesn't fear us because they think we've forgotten who we are. They think we've become tame. We have to prove them wrong." Jorek sighed, running a hand through his short, dark hair. "And what if we prove them right instead? What if those weapons were buried for a reason?" For a moment, the weight of Jorek's words hung in the air. Eris turned back to the viewport, his gaze distant. "Maybe they were," he admitted quietly. "But right now, the only thing worse than using them is doing nothing." The recon team's descent to Earth was a stark reminder of humanity's diminished glory. Once, shuttles had traversed the planet's atmosphere in endless streams of commerce and exploration. Now, the skies were silent save for the occasional thunderstorm ripping through the clouds. The shuttle touched down in the shadow of a mountain range, its landing gear crunching against frostbitten soil. Eris stepped out, the chill biting through his uniform. The air was sharp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and iron. He knelt, scooping a handful of soil in his gloved hand, letting it fall through his fingers. "This is where it started," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "And this is where it will end." The entrance to the bunker was hidden beneath centuries of rock slides and vegetation. It took hours of coordinated effort to clear the debris, the distant howl of the wind masking their grunts of exertion. Finally, the reinforced doors were revealed, massive, weathered, and adorned with faded insignias of a long-dead Earth government. "Here we go," Jorek said, his tone somewhere between awe and trepidation as they activated the doors. The ground trembled faintly, and the doors groaned open, revealing a cavernous interior lined with dormant machinery. The team's flashlights swept across the chamber, illuminating rows of what could only be described as leviathans of war. Towering ships, sleek and angular, their surfaces etched with intricate patterns of circuitry, loomed in eerie silence. Eris stepped forward, his breath visible in the cold. He placed a hand on the nearest vessel, feeling the faint hum of dormant energy beneath its surface. "Wake up," he whispered, as if speaking to an ancient beast. "It's time to remind the galaxy who we are." The lights flickered, a low rumble reverberating through the chamber as the ship's systems stirred to life. The air thickened with a sense of impending change, as if the universe itself held its breath. Behind him, Jorek muttered, "I hope to hell you know what you're doing." Eris didn't look back. "So do I." The ship's awakening was neither gentle nor silent. Deep within its colossal frame, ancient mechanisms roared to life with the ferocity of a caged predator stirred after centuries of restless dormancy. The vibrations rippled through the ground beneath Eris Veyron's boots, resonating in his chest like a second heartbeat. A sharp, metallic tang filled the air as the once dormant war machine exhaled its first breath, the chill of the chamber now replaced with a palpable heat that prickled against his skin. Eris stepped back, his eyes locked on the vessel towering before him. The obsidian spear was a masterpiece of ancient human engineering, angular and brutal in design, its surface marred by age yet emanating a cold, deadly beauty. The patterns of circuitry etched into its hull pulsed faintly with an eerie blue light, like veins carrying some long-forgotten lifeblood. "It's alive," Lieutenant Jorek Dalen murmured, his voice tinged with reluctant awe. He stood a few feet behind Eris, his rifle slung across his back, though his fingers rested uneasily near the grip. "I didn't think this thing would even power up, let alone this." "Alive is one way to put it," Eris replied. His tone clipped as he moved closer to a console jutting from the floor. Dust and time had settled into every crevice, but the faint glow of activation now illuminated the symbols carved into its surface. "If the rest of the fleet looks like this, the Empire has no idea what's coming." Yorick glanced over his shoulder at the rest of the team, their expressions a mix of fear and fascination. You're putting a lot of faith in a bunch of ships older than recorded history. What if they're more trouble than they're worth? Eris didn't answer immediately. His fingers danced across the console, tracing symbols and deciphering commands with a precision that betrayed how much he had studied the buried history of humanity's long-lost weaponry. He found a switch, a recessed panel that felt both alien and eerily familiar under his fingertips. With a decisive twist, the console hissed, releasing a gust of cold air as the ship's systems flared brighter. "This isn't faith," Eris finally said, his voice firm. "This is necessity. Either we use what's left of our ancestors' brilliance, or we watch the Empire turn Earth into dust." Yorick opened his mouth to respond, but a sudden shift in the chamber stole the words from his throat. The obsidian spear groaned as its colossal hanger clamps released, the sound reverberating like the creak of ancient bones. Dust rained down from the ceiling, catching in the artificial light now illuminating the space. The ship lifted slightly from its berth, its anti-gravity systems sparking to life with an audible thrumming. "Commander!" One of the engineers, a younger man named Kane, called out. His voice cracked with urgency as he pointed to a secondary monitor on the console. "We've got company. Imperial scouts just dropped out of orbit. Looks like they tracked the activation signal." Eris's jaw tightened, his mind racing through the implications. Of course the activation had been a beacon. It was like lighting a torch in the darkest cave, an unmistakable announcement of life. He turned to the rest of the team, his voice slicing through the rising panic. "Get to the shuttle. Now, Yorick, secure the exit. We need to move before those scouts pinpoint our location." Yorick snapped into action, barking orders to the team as they scrambled toward the tunnel leading back to the surface. Eris lingered, his gaze flicking between the activation console and the ship itself. He knew leaving it here wasn't an option. If the Empire found the obsidian spear, they would dismantle it piece by piece and bury humanity's last hope once again. He tapped a command into the console, initiating a secondary sequence. The ship's lights brightened, and the chamber shook as its engines, vast labyrinthine constructs hidden deep within its hull, roared to full power. A voice, cold and mechanical, yet imbued with an unsettling clarity, echoed from the console. "Obsidian spear operational. Awaiting command." The sound sent a chill down Eris's spine, but he didn't hesitate. "Prepare for extraction," he said, his voice steady, "and follow my shuttle's trajectory once we're clear." "Acknowledged," the voice replied, the word precise and emotionless. Eris turned and sprinted toward the tunnel, his boots pounding against the metal floor. The team was already ahead, their footsteps echoing in the narrow passageway as they ascended toward the surface. The air grew thinner and colder as they climbed, each breath a sharp reminder of the altitude. Yorick was waiting near the entrance, his rifle raised as the first signs of the Imperial scouts became visible. 3 small ships hovered in the distance, their sleek forms glinting under the pale light of Earth's sun. They moved with predatory grace, scanning the terrain like wolves hunting prey. "They're fanning out," Yorick said without looking back. "We don't have much time." Eris reached him, his breath steady despite the exertion. "Kane, is the shuttle ready?" The younger man's voice crackled over the comm. "Yes, sir. Engines are hot and we're good to go." "Then we move. Now." The team sprinted toward the shuttle, its sleek frame half buried in a shallow ravine to conceal it from aerial detection. The whine of approaching Imperial craft grew louder, their searchlights cutting through the haze of the mountain air. Eris could feel the tension in his team, their movements sharp and precise as they boarded the shuttle. Inside, the cockpit was a flurry of motion as Kane and another pilot powered up the systems. Eris took a seat near the rear, strapping himself in as the engines roared to life. The shuttle lurched upward, its thrusters kicking up a cloud of dust and debris. "Scouts on our tail," Yorick called from his position near the viewport, his rifle trained on the approaching ships. "They're not letting us go without a fight." Eris leaned forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Kane, take us low through the canyon. Use the terrain to mask our trajectory." The shuttle banked sharply, diving into the jagged expanse of the mountain range. The Imperial ships followed, their weapons firing sporadically as they struggled to maintain a lock. The canyon walls blurred past, close enough to scrape the shuttle's hull if the pilots made a single mistake. "Commander," Jorik said, his tone tense but steady, "this isn't sustainable. We need a plan." Eris's mind raced. He glanced at the console near his seat, where a small holographic display showed the obsidian spear still buried beneath the mountain. The ship's activation signal pulsed faintly, a reminder of the power lying dormant within. "Patch me through to the spear," he ordered. Kane hesitated, then complied. The same cold, mechanical voice filled the cabin, awaiting command. Eris's jaw tightened as he made his decision. "Target the Imperial scouts. Precision strikes only. Engage on my mark." The shuttle burst from the canyon into open air, the Imperial ships closing in like vultures. Eris watched the display, his fingers gripping the edge of his seat. Mark. From the depths of the mountain, a surge of blue energy erupted. The obsidian spear fired its first shot in centuries, a beam of light that sliced through the lead scout with surgical precision. The ship disintegrated, its debris scattering like ash in the wind. The remaining scouts hesitated, their movements faltering. Eris allowed himself a grim smile. "Welcome back, Spear." The battle had only just begun. The battle was over almost as quickly as it began. The obsidian spear delivered its strikes with the precision of a predator striking its prey, reducing the remaining Imperial scouts to plumes of shattered metal and burning wreckage. The silence that followed was sharp, oppressive, and filled the cabin of the shuttle with unspoken questions. Eris Veyron stared at the holographic display as the debris drifted lazily in the atmosphere, flickering flames lighting up the jagged canyon below like the embers of a dying fire. His chest tightened, not with relief but with the weight of what this victory meant. The Empire would know, and they would retaliate. "Well, that's one way to announce we're back," Jorik said, his rifle slung back over his shoulder. His tone was lighter than the moment demanded, but his eyes betrayed unease. He leaned against the bulkhead, tension coiled in every muscle. Eris didn't reply. Instead, he turned to Kine, who was running diagnostics on the shuttle. "What's the status of the spear?" Kane didn't look up, his fingers dancing across the console. "Operational, but only just. Whatever power source is keeping it running isn't infinite. If we're going to bring the rest of the fleet online, we'll need a more stable solution." Eris nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the viewport. The mountains stretched far below them, shrouded in low-hanging mist that seemed to writhe with every gust of wind. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice quieter now. "But first, we need to disappear before the Empire sends reinforcements." The shuttle banked sharply as it ascended, the metallic scent of ionized particles filling the cabin from the skirmish. Eris leaned back in his seat, his mind already racing ahead. The Empire's retaliation would be swift, but that wasn't his immediate concern. There was another problem, a larger one. He hadn't told the team everything about what they'd found beneath the mountain. Hours later, deep within the safety of a remote asteroid belt, the Resolute hung in orbit like a solitary sentinel. Its crew moved with quiet efficiency, the weight of what had just transpired written on their faces. No one spoke about what the Empire's response might entail. They didn't have to. The unspoken fear was enough to tighten the air in every corridor. Eris stood in the war room surrounded by maps and holograms of the surrounding systems. A faint rhythmic vibration emanated from the ship's main systems, like a distant drumbeat echoing through the floor beneath his boots. He studied the projections with a hawk-like intensity, his thoughts spiraling. Behind him, Jorik entered, carrying a tablet loaded with the latest reports. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "are you going to tell me what you're really planning? Or do I have to wait for the next crisis to get the full picture?" Eris glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "I'm not withholding anything." Jorik arched a skeptical brow. "You're a terrible liar, Commander." Eris let out a slow breath, his shoulders tightening. He gestured to the holotable, bringing up a schematic of the obsidian spear. Its intricate design shimmered in the air, layers of weaponry and technology displayed like an anatomical diagram. "This," Eris said, his tone low, isn't just a weapon. It's part of something much bigger. When we activated the spear, I found a secondary archive buried in its systems. It mentioned other installations, places we've never mapped, facilities the Empire doesn't know about. Yorick crossed his arms, his gaze narrowing. What kind of installations? Eris hesitated. The kind that could change everything. Weapons. Technology. But there's something else. References to an AI system. Something called Eidolon. It was designed as a failsafe, but the records don't say what for. Yorick stared at him for a long moment, the weight of those words settling like a lead blanket. And you think this Eidolon is still out there? I don't think, Eris replied, his voice sharp. I know. Before Yorick could respond, the door hissed open, and Admiral Thalen entered. The alien's presence was striking. His leathery skin bore the scars of countless battles, and his elongated frame moved with the precision of someone who had lived through lifetimes of war. His eyes, black and depthless, fixed on Eris. You summoned me, Thalen said, his voice smooth but laced with something unreadable. I assume this is about your recent awakening. Eris nodded, gesturing for the Admiral to join them. You've fought the Empire longer than anyone here. You know their weaknesses better than anyone. If this Eidolon exists, it's the kind of thing that could tip the balance in our favor, but we need to know what we're dealing with. Thalen's gaze flicked to the hologram, his expression inscrutable. He traced a long finger across the projection, pausing at a cluster of symbols near the spear's reactor core. These markings, he said softly. I've seen them before. Eris stiffened. Where? The alien's eyes shifted to meet his. In the archives of the Imperial Nexus. They were classified, even from me. But there were whispers, rumors of an ancient AI project the Empire deemed too dangerous to complete. They destroyed it, or so they claimed. Yorick's voice cut through the tension. And you didn't think to mention this before? Thalen's gaze turned cold. Because I didn't believe it still existed. And if it does, you're playing with fire. Eris's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. Fire is the only thing the Empire understands. Thalen tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Then you'd better be prepared for the cost. Later that night, Eris stood alone in his quarters, staring out at the void beyond the viewport. The asteroid belt shimmered faintly in the distance, its fragments catching the weak light of a nearby star. He leaned against the console, his reflection fractured in the glass. The weight of the day pressed down on him, heavier than it had in years. For all his confidence, doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. The obsidian spear was only the beginning. If Eidolon truly existed, it could either be humanity's salvation or its undoing. A soft chime broke the silence, signaling an incoming transmission. Eris straightened, his expression hardening. Veyron here. The screen flickered to life, revealing the face of a young officer stationed in the comms bay. His voice was tight with urgency. Commander, we've intercepted a transmission from the Empire. It's encoded, but we managed to decrypt part of it. Eris frowned. What does it say? The officer hesitated, then spoke carefully. They're mobilizing their fleet. They know about the spear, and they're sending something they called the Ascendant Mind. The words sent a chill down Eris's spine. He didn't move for a moment, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Keep monitoring, he ordered, his voice sharper than intended, and double our defenses. I want to know exactly what's coming before it gets here. As the transmission ended, Eris turned back to the viewport. The fractured reflection stared back at him, its gaze unyielding. The Ascendant Mind, he muttered under his breath, the words lingering like a storm cloud on the horizon. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of something unfamiliar. Fear. He clenched his fists, forcing the emotion down. Whatever this weapon was, whatever the Empire was planning, he would meet it head-on. Because there was no turning back now. The war had already begun. The air inside the Resolute was taut with tension, an almost electric charge that seemed to settle in the spaces between conversations. In the war room, every word was clipped, every glance weighted with unspoken urgency. Eris Veyron stood at the center of it all, staring at the holographic projection of Imperial fleet movements. The words, Ascendant Mind, hovered in the back of his thoughts like an open wound. He couldn't afford to dwell on it, not yet. There were more immediate threats to deal with. "Commander," Jorik's voice interrupted, sharp and focused. "We've confirmed the location of the Imperial weapons facility. It's heavily fortified, shield generators, orbital defense platforms, ground troops. If we hit it, we'll be walking into hell." Eris's gaze didn't waver. "Then we take the fight to hell. That facility houses one of the largest munitions reserves in this sector. If we want to level the playing field, we need what's inside." Jorik leaned over the table, his jaw tight. "This isn't a clean extraction. The Empire won't just let us waltz in and grab what we need." "I'm not asking for clean," Eris replied, his tone like tempered steel. "I'm asking for results." Before Jorik could respond, the door slid open, and Admiral Thalon entered. His alien frame seemed to carry its own gravity, the quiet authority of someone who had seen countless battles and survived them all. "Your team isn't ready for this," Thalon said, his voice as smooth as oil over water. "The Empire's defenses will shred your forces before they even breach the perimeter." Eris turned to him, unflinching. "Then we need to make sure they're looking somewhere else." Thalon raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "A distraction?" "More than that," Eris said, pacing now, his mind already moving ahead. "We send the Obsidian Spear into orbit, make it look like we're staging a full-scale assault. While they're focused on the ship, we hit the ground and take what we need." Jorik shook his head, skepticism etched across his face. "You're gambling everything on them falling for it. What if they don't?" "They will," Eris said, his voice steady, "because they won't expect us to fight like this. They think we're desperate scavengers. Let's remind them that Earth doesn't fight fair." The launch was swift and brutal, the kind of operation that left no room for hesitation. The Obsidian Spear emerged from the asteroid belt like a phantom, its hull reflecting the cold light of the distant star. It moved with deliberate menace, its weapons systems fully charged and aimed squarely at the Imperial facility below. Inside the ship, automated systems hummed with life, a symphony of machinery calibrated for precision and destruction. The crew aboard the Resolute watched the display in tense silence, their breaths shallow as they tracked the spear's trajectory. "Enemy response detected," one of the technicians called out. "Imperial forces are mobilizing. They've dispatched 3 cruisers to intercept." "Good," Eris said, his eyes fixed on the holotable. "That's exactly what we want." The Obsidian Spear fired its first volley, a barrage of plasma rounds that illuminated the void like streaks of molten light. The Imperial facility's orbital defenses scrambled to respond, their turrets swiveling to meet the onslaught. Explosions rippled across the holographic display, each one a testament to the chaos unfolding above. Eris didn't wait to see the outcome. "Jorik, it's time. Move the strike team into position." The drop was violent, the shuttle shuddering as it pierced the atmosphere. The air around them grew dense, the temperature rising as friction licked at the hull. Inside, the team sat strapped into their seats, the tension so thick it felt like a living thing pressing against their skin. Eris's voice cut through the noise. "Listen up. This isn't just about taking their weapons. It's about sending a message. The Empire thinks they've broken us. Today we show them what happens when they push too far." The men nodded, their faces grim but resolute. Jorik tightened the straps on his armor, glancing at Eris with a flicker of dark humor. "You always know how to give a speech." "Just make sure you don't die before it sinks in," Eris shot back, his tone dry. The shuttle hit the ground with a bone-jarring impact, the doors hissing open to reveal the chaos of the battlefield. Imperial troops were already converging on their position, their weapons lighting up the smoke-filled air. The acrid sting of burning metal clung to every breath, a visceral reminder of the stakes. Eris led the charge, his rifle raised as he moved with the precision of a predator. Plasma bolts sizzled past him, close enough to sear the edges of his armor. He ducked behind a shattered wall, returning fire in short, calculated bursts that sent Imperial soldiers crumpling to the ground. "Cover the left flank," he barked, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "We need to push forward." Jorik and another soldier, Dren Callan, flanked him, their movements synchronized. Callan was younger, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, but his aim was steady as he laid down, suppressing fire. "We're pinned down!" Callan shouted, his voice taut with adrenaline. Eris's mind worked quickly, his eyes scanning the battlefield. He spotted a weak point in the Imperial defenses, a gap between two supply crates where their soldiers were clustered too closely. "Jorik, grenade! Now!" Jorik didn't hesitate. He pulled a grenade from his belt, primed it, and hurled it with a practiced motion. The explosion was deafening, the shock wave rippling through the air and throwing debris in every direction. The gap was cleared. "Move!" Eris commanded, his team surging forward. The entrance to the facility loomed ahead, a massive structure of reinforced steel and concrete. The team breached the doors with a precision charge, the explosion echoing through the corridors as they stormed inside. The interior was a labyrinth of machinery and storage units, the air thick with the tang of coolant and oil. "Find the munitions stockpile," Eris ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We don't have much time." The team split up, their boots pounding against the metal floor as they searched. Eris moved quickly, his rifle at the ready, every shadow a potential threat. He rounded a corner and came face to face with an Imperial officer. The man raised his weapon, but Eris was faster. A single shot, and the officer crumpled. "Commander," Jorik's voice crackled over the comm. "We found it, Storage Bay 6. You're going to want to see this." Eris reached the storage bay moments later, his breath catching at the sight. Rows upon rows of munitions lined the walls, each one labeled with Imperial insignias. But it wasn't just weapons. At the center of the room was a massive containment unit, its surface etched with glowing symbols that seemed almost alive. "What the hell is that?" Jorik asked, his voice low. Eris approached the unit cautiously, his fingers brushing against the surface. The symbols pulsed faintly, a rhythm that matched the quickening of his heartbeat. He didn't know what it was, but he knew it was important. "Whatever it is," he said quietly, "it's ours now." As the team began loading the munitions onto transport carts, an alarm blared, the sharp wail cutting through the air like a knife. Imperial reinforcements were on their way. Eris clenched his jaw. "We're out of time. Get everything you can and fall back to the shuttle." Outside, the battle raged on. The obsidian spear was holding its own, its weapons carving through the Imperial fleet with surgical precision. But Eris knew it couldn't last forever. As they made their escape, his mind raced. The containment unit was a mystery, but it was one they couldn't ignore. Whatever the Empire had been hiding, it was worth protecting, and that meant it was worth stealing. In the distance, the obsidian spear unleashed another volley, the light from its weapons illuminating the darkened sky. Eris watched for a moment, the weight of the war settling heavily on his shoulders. This was only the beginning. The Resolute drifted within the dense shadows of a nebula, its outline muted by the swirling clouds of gas and light. The ship had been stripped of its usual hum of activity. What little noise remained came in muffled footsteps and clipped orders, every man aboard aware that the next move would shape humanity's future. Eris Veyron stood in the dimly lit war room, his silhouette stark against the holographic projections around him. The containment unit from the Imperial facility sat in the center of the room, an angular monolith of alien alloy and glowing symbols. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat made of light, casting shifting patterns across the walls. The symbols seemed almost alive, dancing in rhythms too precise to be random. Lieutenant Jorik Dalon entered, his boots clanging softly against the grated floor. He held a datapad, its display flickering faintly. "We've run every scan we can think of," he began, keeping his voice low. "Magnetic, thermal, molecular. We even tried decrypting the energy patterns coming off that thing. Whatever it is, Commander, it's like nothing I've seen before." "Or like anything we were meant to see," Eris murmured, his gaze never leaving the containment unit. Jorik leaned on the edge of the holotable, tension radiating off him in waves. "So, what do we do? Crack it open? Hope it doesn't melt the entire ship in the process?" Eris let the words hang in the air, his thoughts spiraling. The unit wasn't just a relic of Imperial technology. It was something more, something older. He could feel it in the air, the faint charge of anticipation that prickled along his skin every time he was near it. This was no ordinary weapon. It was a keystone, a missing piece to a puzzle he didn't yet understand. "We don't crack it," Eris finally said, his voice heavy with resolve. "Not until we know exactly what we're dealing with. Get Dr. Veyron on it. If anyone can decipher those symbols, it's him." "Venar's already working himself into an early grave," Jorik replied, his brow furrowed. "You've got the man decoding ancient Earth war machines, and now this? He'll lose it." Eris turned to him, the faint glow from the containment unit catching the sharp angles of his face. "Then he'll have to hold it together. If this thing is what I think it is, it's worth the risk." Jorik's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I'll make sure he stays focused." Hours passed like the creeping tide, and the air aboard the Resolute grew heavier with each minute of unanswered questions. In the engineering bay, Dr. Veyron worked in near silence, his tools scattered across the workstation. The containment unit loomed over him, its surface alive with glowing etchings that pulsed faintly under his focused gaze. Jorik stood nearby, arms crossed, as he watched the scientist work. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "you could take a break, maybe eat something." Veyron didn't look up. "I'll eat when I'm dead, which might be sooner than I'd like if I can't figure this out." "Encouraging," Jorik muttered, leaning against the bulkhead. Veyron finally straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. His hands were steady, but his face betrayed his exhaustion. "It's not just a containment unit," he said, his voice tinged with something between awe and dread. "It's a control node." Jorik raised an eyebrow. "Control for what?" Veyron turned to face him, his expression grim. "Something big. This isn't just a device, it's part of a larger system. Whatever the Empire is building, this thing is its brain." Before Jorik could respond, the intercom crackled to life. "Veyron, Jorik, report to the war room immediately," came Eris's clipped voice. "We've got a problem." When they arrived in the war room, Eris was already standing over the holotable, the holographic display flickering with new information. Admiral Thelon was there as well, his presence commanding even in silence. "What's going on?" Jorik asked as he and Veyron approached. Eris didn't look up. "We've intercepted another Imperial transmission. They're deploying a fleet, bigger than anything we've seen so far." Jorik frowned. "To hunt the spear?" "No," Eris said, his voice heavy. "To escort the Ascendant Mind. It's on the move." The words landed like a physical blow, silencing the room. Veyron stepped closer, his face pale. "The Ascendant Mind. It's real, then." "More than real," Thalon interjected, his voice as cold and sharp as a blade. "And now we know what it's capable of." He gestured to the hologram, which shifted to display a series of scattered Imperial colonies. One by one, they were marked with red icons, designating them as sites of subjugation. "The mind isn't just an AI," Thalon explained. "It's a weapon of mass control. It doesn't destroy civilizations, it bends them. Entire populations reduced to mindless servitude, their wills stripped away. And now it's headed for Earth." The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of the revelation settling over the room like a shroud. Jorik was the first to speak, his voice low and taut. "So what do we do? We can't take on a fleet that size, not with just the spear." "We don't have to," Eris said, his gaze hard as steel. "We don't need to destroy the fleet. We just need to stop the mind." Veyron frowned. "And how do you propose we do that?" Eris tapped a command into the holotable, bringing up a schematic of the containment unit. "This thing is a control node," he said. "If we can integrate it with the spear's systems, we might be able to override the Ascendant Mind's network, turn their weapon against them." "That's a hell of a gamble," Jorik said, his tone sharp. "It's not a gamble," Eris replied, his voice steady. "It's our only chance." The operation was set in motion with a precision born of desperation. The obsidian spear was prepped for combat, its systems recalibrated to interface with the containment unit. The process was painstaking, every wire and connection a delicate dance between ancient technology and modern ingenuity. In the ship's control room, Eris watched as Veyron worked, his hands moving with the precision of a surgeon. The air was thick with the faint heat radiating from the machinery, a reminder of how close they were to pushing the limits of what the spear could handle. "We're ready," Veyron finally said, stepping back from the console. His face was pale, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "But I'll be honest, Commander. If this fails, the spear systems could overload. We'd be dead in seconds." "Understood," Eris said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But if we don't stop the Ascendant Mind, we're already dead." As the ship prepared to engage, Eris turned to Jorik. "Get the team ready. We're going to need boots on the ground if this doesn't work." Jorik nodded, his expression grim. "You really think we can pull this off?" Eris met his gaze, his eyes unyielding. "We don't have a choice." As the obsidian spear powered up, its weapon systems glowing like the embers of a dying star, Eris took one last look at the containment unit. The symbols were pulsing faster now, as if aware of the battle to come. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. And this time, humanity wasn't fighting to survive. It was fighting to win. The obsidian spear drifted through the void like a predator stalking its prey, its angular hull catching the faint glow of a distant star. Inside, the air was heavy with a palpable tension, the kind that wrapped itself around the chest and made every breath feel deliberate. Eris Veyron stood at the helm, his hands gripping the edge of the console. The faint vibrations of the ship's systems pulsed through the floor, a subtle reminder of the Leviathan under his command. "Status," Eris demanded, his voice sharp. Lieutenant Jorik Delon glanced up from his station, his expression grim but steady. "The containment unit is fully integrated into the spear's systems. Dr. Veyron says it'll work, theoretically." "Theoretically?" Eris shot back, his eyes narrowing. Veyron's voice crackled over the comm, a mix of exhaustion and irritation. "It's not exactly like I've had a manual to work with, Commander. This is ancient tech interfacing with a control node designed centuries later. You're lucky it hasn't torn itself apart." Eris exhaled slowly, forcing his frustration to the back of his mind. "It'll have to do. What about the Imperial fleet?" Jorik tapped a series of commands into his console, bringing up a holographic display of the surrounding sector. The Imperial ships were moving in a tight formation, their sleek, dagger-like designs exuding menace. At the center of the fleet was the Ascendant Mind, a monolithic ship unlike any other, its surface bristling with weaponry and shield generators. The data streams flowing from the spear indicated energy signatures far beyond anything Eris had seen before. "They're staying in formation around the mind," Jorik reported. "It's like they're guarding a god." Eris studied the projection, his jaw tightening. "A god can bleed. We just have to find the right place to cut." The plan was deceptively simple. The obsidian spear would draw the fleet's attention, engaging them in a head-on assault. At the same time, a strike team led by Eris himself would infiltrate the Ascendant Mind using a cloak transport. Their objective: disable the Mind's core systems and use the integrated containment unit to override its network. It was a gamble of the highest order, but Eris knew there was no other option. The Mind wasn't just a weapon, it was the Empire's trump card. If they didn't stop it here, humanity wouldn't get another chance. As the spear closed in on the Imperial fleet, the void around them seemed to grow darker, the distant stars swallowed by the overwhelming presence of the enemy ships. The crew moved with quiet precision, their movements fluid and deliberate as they prepared for what was to come. Eris turned to Jorik, his voice low. "You know what to do if we don't make it back?" Jorik met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "You're assuming I'd let you go out in a blaze of glory without me." "This isn't about glory," Eris replied. "It's about survival." Jorik smirked faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Then let's make sure you come back." The strike team boarded the cloaked transport in silence, the weight of their mission pressing down on them like a lead blanket. The interior of the shuttle was dimly lit, the only sound the faint hum of the cloaking device as it strained to keep them invisible. Eris sat near the front, his rifle resting across his lap. His team was small, 5 men, each one chosen for their skill and reliability. Yorick was among them, seated across from Eris. He was checking his gear, his movements precise and methodical. "So, what's the plan when we get on board? Smile and wave?" Eris allowed himself a faint smile. "Something like that. The mine's core should be in the central chamber. We plant the node, trigger the override, and get out before they know what hit them." "Simple enough," Yorick said dryly. "I'm sure nothing will go wrong." The shuttle shuddered as it docked with the Ascendant Mind, the faint vibrations running through the floor, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that followed. The airlock hissed open, revealing the interior of the Imperial ship. The corridor was dark and sterile, its walls lined with faintly glowing conduits that pulsed with an unsettling rhythm. Eris led the way, his rifle raised as he moved with careful precision. The air inside the ship felt heavy, as though it were pressing down on them from all sides. The conduits along the walls seemed to flicker in response to their presence, the light rippling like water disturbed by an unseen current. "This place gives me the creeps," Yorick muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not alone," one of the other team members replied, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. As they moved deeper into the ship, the sense of unease grew stronger. The corridors twisted and turned in seemingly random patterns, the walls narrowing and then expanding as if the ship itself were alive. The faint sound of distant machinery echoed through the halls, a rhythmic thrum that set their nerves on edge. They reached the central chamber without incident, though the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The chamber was massive, its ceiling stretching high above them and disappearing into darkness. At the center of the room was the core, a towering structure of interlocking machinery and glowing conduits. The light it emitted was harsh and unnatural, casting sharp shadows across the floor. Eris approached the core cautiously, his team spreading out to secure the perimeter. The containment unit was slung over his shoulder, its surface cold against his armor. As he placed it against the core, the symbols on its surface flared to life, casting the room in an eerie blue light. "Venar, we're in position," Eris said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Initiating the interface now." Venar's voice crackled over the comm. "Be careful, Commander. That thing is designed to fight back." Eris activated the unit, his fingers moving quickly across the controls. The core's light pulsed faster, the conduits around the room flickering as the containment unit began to integrate with the mine's systems. The air grew warmer, the faint scent of heated metal filling their lungs. Suddenly the room shook, a low rumble reverberating through the floor. The light from the core intensified, its glow turning an angry red. Alarms blared, their piercing wails cutting through the air like blades. "They know we're here," Yorick said, his rifle snapping to his shoulder. "We've got company." Eris didn't look up from the controls. "Hold them off. I need more time." The first wave of Imperial soldiers stormed into the chamber, their boots echoing against the metal floor. Yorick and the others opened fire, the sharp crack of their weapons mixing with the hiss of plasma bolts. The air was thick with heat and smoke, the acrid tang of burning material stinging their eyes and throats. Eris worked quickly, his fingers flying across the controls as the containment unit fought to override the mine systems. The core's light flickered erratically, the conduits along the walls sparking as the ship itself seemed to rebel against their intrusion. "Almost there," Eris muttered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. The core pulsed one final time, the light from the containment unit spreading across its surface like liquid fire. The alarms cut off abruptly, the silence that followed as jarring as a gunshot. The Imperial soldiers froze, their movements jerky and unnatural as the mine's control over them wavered. Eris stepped back, his chest heaving as he stared at the core. The containment unit was still glowing, its symbols shifting and changing in ways he couldn't understand. "Venar," he said, his voice tight, "it's done. Get ready to pull us out." As the team regrouped, the air around them seemed to grow heavier, the faint hum of the core replaced by a low, resonant vibration. The mind wasn't defeated. It was waking up. The Ascendant Mind's core glowed like a vengeful heart, pulsing with a red that seemed to stain the air itself. The chamber's temperature had risen, the heat rolling off the walls in suffocating waves. Eris Veyron stared at the containment unit, its symbols flickering erratically as it tried to hold its connection to the mind. Every flicker was a battle, each pulse a warning. The mind wasn't just waking, it was fighting back. "We need to move, Commander," Jorik barked, his rifle trained on the doorway as another wave of Imperial soldiers stormed in. Plasma fire lanced through the air, searing the walls and filling the chamber with the bitter tang of scorched metal. "This place is about to turn into a furnace." Eris didn't answer immediately. His eyes were locked on the interface as the symbols on the containment unit began to shift into patterns he didn't recognize. His mind raced, calculating, assessing. The containment unit was doing its job, but the mind's systems were too vast, too integrated to fully override from here. "We're not leaving until this thing is neutralized," Eris said sharply. He turned to Jorik, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Hold the line. I need 2 minutes." Jorik shot him a withering glare. 2 minutes in this hellhole might as well be a lifetime. "Then make it count," Eris snapped. Jorik muttered a curse under his breath, but nodded, signaling the others to take defensive positions. The team moved with precision, their movements sharp and practiced. They fired in controlled bursts, the recoil of their rifles jarring against their shoulders as they kept the enemy at bay. The smell of heated composite and the sharp crackle of shields failing punctuated the battle. Every moment, a fight to survive. Eris turned back to the interface, his mind working faster than his hands. He pulled up the containment unit's internal systems, isolating its primary functions. The override wasn't enough. He needed to disable the mind entirely. But to do that, he would have to risk destabilizing the containment unit. "Venar," Eris said into the comm, his voice low but urgent. "I need options. If the containment unit fails, what happens?" Venar's response was immediate, his voice crackling with tension. "If it fails, the mind regains full control, and we're dead in minutes." But there's another problem. The energy feedback from the containment unit is spiking. It's overloading Spear's systems. Eris's chest tightened. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Venar admitted. "The Spear can't handle that kind of feedback indefinitely. If we don't resolve this soon, it's going to rip itself apart." Eris clenched his jaw, his mind racing. The containment unit wasn't just a tool. It was a ticking bomb. If they couldn't stabilize it, or use it to disable the mind, it would destroy the Spear and everyone aboard it. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. "Jorik," Eris called over his shoulder, his voice sharp. "We're changing the plan. Fall back to the transport. I'm going to set the containment unit to overload." Jorik's head snapped toward him, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. "You're what? That'll kill us all." "Not if we get clear in time," Eris countered. "The overload will take out the core, but it's going to be messy. We need to move, now." Jorik hesitated, his gaze darting between Eris and the battle raging around them. Finally, he nodded, signaling the team to begin their retreat. "You'd better know what you're doing, Commander." Eris didn't respond. He was already working, his fingers flying across the controls as he set the containment unit to destabilize. The symbols on its surface shifted faster now, their light growing brighter, more erratic. The room seemed to pulse with their energy, the air itself vibrating as the unit neared critical mass. 30 seconds, Eris muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Behind him, Jorik and the team were falling back, their movements precise despite the chaos. The transport was waiting in the corridor, its hatch open and its engines already charged. The sharp tang of fuel mixed with the metallic taste of the air, a reminder of how close they were to the edge. Eris finished the sequence and turned, his voice cutting through the noise. "Go! Get to the transport!" Jorik was the last to board, his rifle slung across his back as he reached out a hand to steady Eris. "You're cutting it close," he said, his voice tight. "That's the point," Eris replied, his tone grim. The hatch sealed behind them as the transport launched, the sudden acceleration pressing them back into their seats. Through the viewport, Eris watched as the containment unit reached its peak, the light from its symbols flooding the chamber. The Ascendant Mind seemed to convulse, its conduits sparking and flaring as the unit destabilized. And then, it happened. The containment unit exploded, a surge of energy ripping through the mind's core. The shock wave hit the transport like a hammer, sending it tumbling through the void. Eris braced himself against the seat, the impact jarring through his body as alarms blared around them. "We're clear!" the pilot shouted, his voice tight with adrenaline. "But the spear systems are fluctuating. We need to dock before it tears itself apart." Eris didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the viewport, where the Ascendant Mind was disintegrating, its massive frame collapsing in on itself as the energy from the containment unit consumed it. The red glow of its core flickered, then vanished, leaving only the cold black of space. "It's done," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Jorek glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "For now." Back aboard the Resolute, the crew worked frantically to stabilize the spear's systems. The ship trembled beneath their feet, the strain of the containment unit's feedback still reverberating through its hull. Vanar was in the engineering bay, his hands flying across the controls as he barked orders to his team. "We've rerouted power to the secondary systems," Vanar said, his voice echoing through the comms. "But the spear's reactor took a hit. It's going to need serious repairs." Eris stood in the war room, his hands gripping the edge of the holotable. The holographic display showed the remains of the Ascendant Mind, its fragments drifting through space like the bones of a dead god. But the battle wasn't over. The Imperial fleet was still out there, regrouping, and the spear was barely holding together. Jorek entered, his expression grim. "We've bought ourselves some time, but the Empire's not going to let this go. They'll come after us with everything they've got." Eris nodded, his gaze hard. "Then we make sure they regret it." The room fell silent, the weight of what they'd just accomplished settling over them. The mind was gone, but the war was far from over. And as Eris stared at the holographic display, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was still ahead. The Resolute hung in the void like a battered sword, scarred but unbroken, a testament to the price humanity was willing to pay for its survival. The remnants of the Imperial fleet loomed ahead, scattered but still dangerous. Each ship floated with the precision of a predator, waiting for the wounded prey to falter. The obsidian spear was gone, a brilliant flash of its destruction still etched into the retinas of those who had witnessed it. The air on the bridge of the Resolute felt dense, heavy with the weight of what had been lost and what was still to come. Eris Veyron stood at the center of the bridge, his hands braced against the command console. The dim light of the holographic projection cast sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the lines carved there by exhaustion and resolve. The Imperial fleet was reforming, their intent clear. They weren't retreating. They were regrouping for one final, decisive strike. "They're not breaking off," Jorek Dallon said from his station, his voice low but steady. He scanned the display, his fingers moving across the controls with sharp efficiency. "They're reforming their line. They're going all in." Eris didn't look up, his eyes locked on the display. "Of course they are. The Empire doesn't know how to lose." Jorek leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "And what about us? Do we know how to win?" Eris's lips twitched, a flicker of something that might have been humor if the situation weren't so dire. "We're about to find out." The bridge fell silent except for the soft clatter of keyboards and the faint vibration of the ship's systems struggling to hold together. Each man knew what was at stake, and each understood that the odds were stacked against them. But humanity had been here before, outnumbered, outgunned, underestimated, and every time it had found a way to endure. "We can't outfight them," Jorek said after a moment, his voice breaking the silence. "Not with what we've got left. The spear bought us time, but it's not enough." Eris straightened, his eyes narrowing as he studied the holographic display. "We don't need to outfight them. We just need to remind them why they should fear us." The plan was desperate, but desperation was all they had left. The solar destabilizer, humanity's most devastating weapon, was their last resort. A relic of a darker time, it was designed to trigger the instability of a star, turning it into a weapon of unimaginable destruction. It was not a weapon of war. It was a weapon of annihilation. Eris stood in the war room, the senior officers gathered around the holotable. The projection of the solar destabilizer's target, the system's star, flickered with a faint rhythmic pulse. The room was silent, each man weighing the cost of what they were about to do. "This isn't a victory," Yorick said, finally, breaking the silence. His voice was quieter now, as though the weight of his words pressed against his throat. "This is a warning." Eris looked at him, his expression unreadable. "That's all it needs to be." The men around the table nodded, their faces pale but resolute. They knew what was at stake. The Empire had pushed them to the brink, had forced them to abandon diplomacy, to embrace the fire they had once sworn to contain. But now, the fire was theirs to wield. The Resolute moved into position, its engines straining as it maneuvered into the shadow of the star. The light from the massive orb bathed the ship in a fiery glow, its heat radiating through the reinforced hull. In the weapons bay, the solar destabilizer was being prepared, its systems humming with a low, menacing energy that seemed to vibrate through the air. Eris stood on the bridge, watching as the Imperial fleet closed in. They were cautious now, wary of the trap they sensed but couldn't see. The tension was palpable, a living thing that filled every corner of the ship. "Commander," the weapons officer called out, his voice tight, "the destabilizer is online, ready to fire on your command." Eris didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the display, on the Imperial ships that moved like wolves circling a wounded stag. His crew waited, their breaths held, their hands steady despite the fear clawing at the edges of their resolve. "Transmit the message," Eris said finally, his voice cutting through the silence. Yorick nodded, his hands moving across the console. Moments later, the Resolute's comm system crackled to life, broadcasting across all frequencies. Eris's voice echoed through the void, calm and deliberate. "To the Imperial fleet, this is Commander Eris Veyron of the Resolute. You've pushed us to the edge, burned our worlds, slaughtered our people, and yet we remain. You wanted fire. Now the galaxy will drown in it." The Imperial fleet hesitated, their movements faltering as the message reached them. On board the Resolute, the tension stretched thin, every second an eternity as the crew waited for Eris's next command. "Do it," Eris said, his voice steady. "Fire the destabilizer." The order was given, and the Resolute shuddered as the weapon activated. A beam of energy lanced toward the star, its light blinding as it struck the surface. For a moment, nothing happened. The star seemed to hold its breath, its surface rippling with barely contained energy. And then, it erupted. The star's light intensified, a wave of energy radiating outward in every direction. The Imperial fleet was caught in the blast, their ships disintegrating under the overwhelming force. The Resolute trembled as the shockwave hit, its systems groaning under the strain. The crew held on, their faces lit by the fiery glow of the star's fury. Eris stood at the center of it all, his expression calm as the chaos unfolded around him. He watched as the Imperial fleet was consumed, their arrogance and cruelty reduced to ash. He felt no triumph, no vindication, only the heavy weight of what had been necessary. When the light finally faded, the void was silent once more. The star had stabilized, its brilliance dimmed but steady. The Resolute drifted in the aftermath, its hull scorched, its systems barely holding together. The crew worked in silence, their exhaustion visible in every movement. Yorick approached Eris, his steps slow, his expression unreadable. "It's done," he said quietly. "They're gone." Eris nodded, his gaze distant. "For now." Yorick studied him for a moment, then spoke again. "We sent a message today. Do you think they'll listen?" Eris turned to him, his eyes hard but not unkind. "They'll listen, and they'll remember." He walked to the viewport, staring out at the distant stars. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything they had fought for. "They thought they could burn us out, break us. But humanity doesn't burn. We rise from the ashes." The galaxy would remember this day. The Empire had pushed humanity to the brink, and humanity had answered, not with submission, but with fire. A final warning that echoed through the void, carried on the light of a dying star.